The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling of ink and false promises, and Nora Keller read it 3 times before she believed what it said, that her brother was dead. His claim in the New Mexico territory was hers by right, and the only thing standing between her and everything he had built was 2,000 miles of open country and her own willingness to survive it. She had been told, even before she packed her single trunk and bought her train ticket out of Cincinnati, that the territory would make her hard. Her aunt had said it over a cup of cooling tea, gripping Nora's wrist with papery fingers, and staring at her with the particular sadness of a woman who had watched too many soft things get ruined by rough places. Her employer, a dry goods merchant with a mustache that curled at the ends like question marks, had said it too, shaking his head and offering her a raise if she would only stay. Even the reverend at the corner church, who barely knew her name, had stopped her on the steps one morning and told her that the frontier had a way of stripping a person down to nothing but survival, and that survival, once it became a habit, left very little room for anything else. Nora had listened to all of them with the patience she had spent 26 years cultivating, the patience of a woman who had been told what she was and was not capable of since before she could read. She had nodded. She had thanked them. And then she had finished packing her trunk. What none of them seemed to understand, what she had never quite found the words to explain, was that the hardness they were warning her about was not something that happened to a person from the outside. She had already learned that truth in Cincinnati, in the small and grinding ways that a life without much money and without a man to stand in front of her had taught her things. She had already been cold. She had already been afraid. She had already made decisions in the dark that she would never speak aloud to anyone who asked her if she was all right. The hardness they feared for her was already behind her. What was ahead of her was something else entirely. She arrived in Santa Fe in the spring of 1878, when the air still carried the clean, mineral edge of recent rain, and the mountains to the east stood up against the sky like they had been painted there by someone who had never once doubted their own hand. She stepped off the train with her trunk dragging behind her and $43 in a pouch sewn into the hem of her coat, and she stood on the platform and breathed in the smell of horses and dust and pin-on smoke and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she was standing in the right place. The land office was 2 blocks from the station, and the clerk there, a heavy-set man with ink stains on his fingers and a general air of reluctant competence, confirmed what the letter had said. Her brother Daniel's claim, 160 acres in the Pecos Valley, about 60 miles southeast, was hers to file on, provided she could prove relation, present the original deed, and actually work the land for the period required under the Homestead Act. He laid out the requirements with the flat precision of a man who had explained the same thing so many times it had ceased to mean anything to him. Nora laid out her documents, answered his questions, and signed her name in 3 separate places. She did not ask him if he thought she could do it. She did not need his opinion, and she suspected he would not have given her a useful one. She spent her first night in Santa Fe at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who was originally from Georgia, cooked extraordinary cornbread, and asked no unnecessary questions. Nora ate 2 helpings of supper, slept for 10 hours without waking, and rose before dawn to find a way to get herself and her trunk 60 miles southeast to a piece of land she had never seen. It was Mrs. Caldwell who told her about Ezekiel Rourke. She mentioned him the way a woman mentions something she considers to be practical information rather than a recommendation matter-of-factly, without editorializing, the way she might mention that the well water needed to be boiled, or that the morning stage ran only on Mondays. She said that there was a man who freighted supplies out to the valley settlements 3 times a month, that he was reliable and honest and would not overcharge her, and that he was leaving again in 2 days if she wanted to arrange passage. Nora found him at the livery stable, which seemed to her like exactly the right place for a man described in such practical terms. He was loading a flatbed wagon with flour sacks and wrapped parcels and coils of rope, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this work for long enough that it had stopped being effort and become simply the shape of his days. He was broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where it had gotten too long, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with strong opinions about right angles. He wore a battered hat pushed back on his head, and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the coolness of the morning. And he was, Nora noted with the detached practicality of a woman focused on transportation logistics, somewhere in his early 30s, with the particular weathered quality that the territory put on men who spent most of their time outside. She introduced herself and told him what she needed. He listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady on her face in a way that was not impolite, but was also not the carefully averted consideration that most men offered women they did not know well. He looked at her like she was a person, which she found to her mild surprise to be somewhat startling. "Daniel Keller's claim," he said when she had finished. It was not a question exactly, but the word he put on Daniel's name had weight to it. "You knew my brother," she said. "Some," he said. "He was a decent man. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, because he had said it like he meant it, without the theatrical sympathy that people in Cincinnati had offered her, the kind of condolence that was more about the speaker's sense of propriety than the listener's grief. "I can take you out day after tomorrow," he said. "I've got to run to 3 homesteads in the valley. I'll come by the Caldwell house at first light." "What do you charge?" He named a price that seemed fair, and she agreed to it without bargaining, because she had learned long ago that the time to negotiate was not when you needed something and had no alternatives, but also because something about the way he had quoted the price suggested that it was already as fair as he intended it to be. "One more thing," she said. "Is the claim in good condition? The land?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she read the kind of information that men often communicated through silence rather than words. Not a complete picture, but an indication. "The house needs work," he said finally. "Daniel was sick for a while before the end. There are 2 horses still there, and the well is good. The land itself is solid ground." He paused. "It's not going to be easy, Miss Keller." "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine it will be." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a business conversation, and then he nodded and went back to his loading. She walked back to Mrs. Caldwell's, thinking about the way he had said her brother's name, like a man who kept small debts of affection even after the person they were owed to was gone. The ride out to the valley took most of a day, and somewhere in the middle of it Nora stopped being merely a passenger and became a student of landscape in a way she had not expected. The country unrolled itself around them like something from a painting that was not trying to be beautiful, but simply was, the high desert giving way to grassland, the blue distance of the mountains always present to the west, the sky so enormous and so specifically blue that it seemed like a different color than any sky she had seen before, as if Ohio skies and New Mexico skies were related things, but not the same thing at all. Ezekiel Rourke drove without much conversation, which she appreciated because it meant the conversation that did happen was real rather than obligatory. He told her about the valley settlements, 3 families she would be neighbors to, their names and rough characters, who had been there longest and who had arrived most recently. He told her what the water situation was like, which was important, and what the road was like in wet weather, which was also important. He told her that there was a small trading post about 12 miles north that stocked basic supplies and had a good selection of seeds in spring, and that the man who ran it, a Frenchman named Beaumont who had been there for 20 years, was generally trustworthy and occasionally infuriating. He did not tell her that it would be fine, or that she would adjust, or any of the other false comfort words that people offered to make themselves feel better about delivering unwelcome realities. She noticed this and appreciated it. "How long have you been freighting?" she asked at one point when they had been riding in companionable silence for long enough that a question did not feel like an intrusion. 7 years, he said, Before that, I was working cattle up in Colorado. What made you change? He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to most questions, which was a quality she was finding herself increasingly attentive to, the sense that he actually thought about what you asked him before he answered. I liked moving, he said. Cattle work keeps you in one place too long for my taste, but freighting keeps you moving and keeps you useful. I'd rather be useful than still. That's an interesting distinction. He glanced at her sideways. What do you mean? Most people think of useful and still as being compatible. You sit in one place and you serve the place you're in. You're saying the movement itself is part of what makes it worthwhile. He was quiet for a moment. I hadn't thought of it exactly that way, he said. But yes, I suppose that's right. The sun had moved considerably westward by the time they turned off the main road onto a track that cut through tall grass toward a low ridge. On the other side of the ridge, she could see the glint of a roof, and something tightened in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anticipation, but was made of both. Daniel had built his house from adobe and timber, a low structure with 2 rooms and a porch along the front, and a good stone chimney. The yard around it had gone somewhat wild in the months since his illness had taken hold, but the bones of what he had built were solid, and the well, when Ezekiel lowered the bucket, drew up clean, cold water that had the faint, sweet mineral taste of deep rock. The 2 horses in the small corral looked thin but not ruined. The south-facing field had been broken and was ready for planting, though it needed more work before seed could go in. She stood in the doorway of the house for a long time, looking at the interior, at her brother's things still in their places, his hat on a peg by the door, his Bible on the table, his boots standing by the cold hearth like they were waiting for him. She did not cry. She was not made of stone, but she had used up that particular grief in Cincinnati when the letter came, alone in her room at the boarding house where she had been living since their mother died. And what was left now was something quieter and more purposeful. She was aware that Ezekiel was behind her, unloading her trunk from the wagon with careful discretion, giving her whatever this moment was without making it more than it needed to be. "Thank you," she said, turning, "for the ride and for your patience." He set her trunk down on the porch and dusted his hands on his trousers. "I'll be back through in 3 weeks," he said. "If you need anything before then, the Merriman place is about 4 miles east. Clara Merriman is a good woman." "I know," she said. "You mentioned her on the road." A corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "So I did." He put his hat back properly on his head. "Good luck, Miss Keller." "Nora," she said. "Since you knew my brother and we've had a fairly long conversation, I think we can manage first names." He looked at her with that steady, considering quality she was already learning to recognize. "Nora," he said. It was nothing more than an acknowledgement, just her name said in return, but something about the way it sounded in his voice, unhurried, like it was something worth taking care with, made her want to take a small, careful breath. "Ezekiel," she said. He nodded, climbed back onto his wagon seat, and clicked his horse into motion. She watched him go until he was over the ridge and the sound of wheels on hard ground faded into the extraordinary quiet of the valley. Then she went inside and set about making her brother's house into her own. The first 3 weeks were the kind of difficult that she had been warned about, but that no one's words had fully prepared her for, not because of any one catastrophe, but because of the accumulating weight of small, unrelenting work. She cleaned the house thoroughly, removing 3 months of dust and absence. She repaired the worst of the fence around the horse corral. She turned additional earth in the south field with a heavy-handled plow that made her shoulders ache in ways she had not previously known her shoulders could ache. She planted corn and beans and squash in the pattern she had read about in a pamphlet at the land office, the old growing method that she had since learned from Clara Merriman, who stopped by on her 4th day with a pan of food and a warm, practical manner that Nora found enormously comforting. Was something that had been used in this land for much longer than any of the current settlers had been there. Clara was 31, weathered and competent and direct, with a husband named Roy who was quiet and hardworking, and 2 children under 5 who regarded Nora with the unguarded curiosity of very small people. She became, in the way that frontier neighbors became things, essential almost immediately. She knew which plants were edible and which were not. She knew where the rattlesnakes liked to be in the warm hours of the day and how to identify their sound. She knew the patterns of weather in the valley and what certain cloud formations over the mountains meant, and she shared this knowledge freely, without condescension, woman to woman. On the day that Nora drove a nail through her left hand while repairing a section of roof, not deeply, not badly, but enough to bleed considerably and require binding, Clara cleaned, and wrapped it with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had dealt with worse, and looked at Nora with an expression that was not sympathy exactly, but was something like recognition. "First month is the worst," she said. "So I keep hearing," Nora said. "Doesn't make it not true." Clara tied off the bandage with brisk efficiency. "You're managing better than most do. Most people that come out here from the East spend the first month just sitting with the shock of how much work there is. You haven't stopped moving since you arrived." "Stopping feels dangerous," Nora admitted. "That's because it is, at least at first." Clara sat back and regarded her with calm, steady eyes. "Once you find your rhythm, it's not so bad. The work becomes part of you. You stop fighting it and it stops being so heavy." Nora thought about this. "When did that happen for you?" "Second spring," Clara said. "My first winter out here I cried most nights. By my second planting season I found I wasn't crying anymore. Not because things had gotten easier exactly, but because I'd gotten bigger." She paused, seeming to consider her own words. "That's the best way I can put it. The land didn't make me harder, it made me bigger." Nora held the thought carefully. She thought about her aunt and the Reverend and her former employer with his curling mustache. She thought about the word hard and the way it had been said to her, like hardness was the inevitable cost of surviving difficult places, like something soft and good had to be given up in the exchange. She did not think that was right. She had not thought it was right when people said it to her. And Clara Merriman, sitting in this adobe kitchen with her practical hands and her calm eyes and her life built by her own effort in this extraordinary difficult place, seemed to confirm the thing Nora had suspected all along. There was a difference between hard and strong, between being diminished and being built up, between losing something and becoming more than you had been. Ezekiel came back through at the end of the 3rd week, as he had said he would. She was in the south field when she heard the wagon, straightening her back from the work of thinning seedlings, and she shaded her eyes and watched him come over the ridge and down the track. He pulled up in the yard and climbed down with an ease that she had already noticed was his natural mode of movement, not hurried, not slow, simply unhurried and competent. "Nora," he said, by way of greeting. "Ezekiel," she said, coming in from the field with dirt on her hands and her hair pinned up but coming loose on one side. She was aware briefly of what she must look like, and then was amused by her own awareness, because she had not particularly cared what she looked like in 3 weeks and there was no sensible reason to start now. "How are you getting on?" he asked, and it was not the social question, the polite inquiry that expected a fine thank you as its answer. He was actually looking around at the place, the field, the patched corral fence, the house, and asking with genuine interest. "Well enough," she said. "Better than I expected, I think. I had the left field plowed and planted by the end of the 1st week, and the north section will be ready for seed in another 2. I've been letting the horses pasture on the grass east of the corral. I found a problem with the chimney mortar, but I've repaired it." She paused, "and I drove a nail through my hand, but that's healed up." He looked at her hand. "Through. Not entirely through, just significantly in." She showed him the healing puncture. "Clara Merriman cleaned it up. Clara's good for that." He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the property with that assessing quality. "You've done a lot," he said. "I had to. Most people in your position," he stopped, "would have turned around and gone home," she finished. "I know," she tilted her head. "Were you expecting me to?" He was quiet for a moment that she read carefully. "I wasn't sure," he said finally, with the honesty that she was coming to understand was his default position. People come out here with good intentions and find out those aren't enough. I didn't know which kind you were. And now, he looked at her with those steady dark eyes, now I think you might be the kind that builds something real. It was not a romantic thing, he said. It was an assessment, the way he would assess a piece of land or a well-built fence. But something about being seen that way accurately, without flattery, but also without the habitual underestimation she had lived with for 26 years, moved something in her that she was not quite ready to look at directly. I need to order a few things, she said, moving the conversation to practical ground. Do you have paper? He had paper. They sat on her porch in the late afternoon sun, and she gave him her list: salt, coffee, a particular kind of seed she needed, some hardware for a repair she had been putting off for lack of materials. And he wrote it down in the neat, small handwriting of a man who was more educated than he sometimes let on. And she watched his hand move across the paper and thought about the way he had said, now, I think you might be the kind that builds something real. He stayed for supper, which she offered, and he accepted without the excessive courtly refusal that would have been tiresome. She made beans and cornbread and the last of the salt pork she had brought from Santa Fe, and they ate at the table in the kitchen in the long golden evening light that came through the single west-facing window, and they talked. They talked about her brother Daniel, about what he had been like in the valley, the specific version of him that Ezekiel had known. A quieter man than she had remembered from childhood, thoughtful, the kind of settler who spent more time learning the land than fighting it. They talked about the territory, about Santa Fe and its particular complicated character, Spanish and Native and American all pressed together in ways that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes violent and always interesting. They talked about Cincinnati, which he had never been to, and Colorado, where he had worked cattle, and the difference between places that felt temporary and places that felt like they were asking you to stay. Outside, the darkness came on slowly, the way it does in that high desert country where the sky holds light long after the sun is down, the mountains going from gold to purple to the deep blue-black of a sky that had more stars than any sky she had seen before. I should go, he said, though neither of them had looked at the time. You have deliveries in the morning, she said. I do. He carried his plate to the wash basin, which she had not asked him to do, and she noted this. He put his hat on at the door and said good night with the particular quality of a person who has been more comfortable somewhere than they expected and is now calibrating that fact. 3 weeks, she said. When you come back. 3 weeks, he confirmed. She stood on the porch and watched him hitch his horses and drive out, and the stars were so thick overhead that she could see his hat brim outlined against them for a long time before he disappeared over the ridge. Over the weeks that followed, she fell into the rhythm that Clara had described, the rhythm that was not the absence of difficulty but rather the absorption of it, the way the body learns to carry what it carries without cataloging each weight. Her days were structured by light and water and the requirements of growing things, and there was a satisfaction in this that she had not expected, a specific cleanness to work that had direct and visible results. You plowed. Things grew. The correlation was not guaranteed, but it was honest. She made other friends in the valley. Beyond Clara and Roy Merriman, there was Hector and Lucia Vargas 2 miles south, who had been in the valley 15 years and whose family had been in this land for generations before that, and who brought her peppers and fresh cheese and taught her, through Lucia's patient demonstration and Nora's increasingly capable Spanish, 100 things about this landscape that no pamphlet from any land office would ever have thought to include. There was old Beaumont at the trading post, who was exactly as infuriating and trustworthy as Ezekiel had described, and who gave her credit without being asked and charged her the same prices he charged everyone, which she appreciated because it was 1878, and a lone woman without a man on her claim was still a novelty that provoked a range of responses. Not all of those responses were kind. The first time she rode into Santa Fe alone to file a quarterly report with the land office, a man at the freight office made a series of comments about what a woman alone must be looking for that were gross enough that two other men looked away in embarrassment. She handled this by looking at him with an expression she had been developing since approximately age 14 and saying, in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, that if he had something useful to say she was willing to listen, and if he did not she would prefer he direct his attention elsewhere. He had made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a grunt, and she had walked past him and done her business, and ridden home with her dignity intact and her anger, which was real, managed in the part of herself where she kept things that needed processing before they could be expressed. It was Ezekiel who told her on his next visit that the man she had silenced at the freight office had apparently mentioned the encounter to several people, and that the consensus, according to what he had heard, was that Daniel Keller's sister was something to be taken seriously. As opposed to what they thought before, she said. As opposed to what some people assumed based on the fact of you being a woman alone on a claim, he said, without apparent embarrassment at the observation. What did you assume? She asked. She was not sure why she asked this. Something about the directness of his manner encouraged a reciprocal directness. He was quiet in the particular way she had learned meant he was actually thinking about the question rather than preparing a polite deflection. They were sitting on the porch, as had become their custom when he came through, the late afternoon extending around them with that generosity of light that this country seemed to have as a standing characteristic. When Mrs. Caldwell told me about you, I thought you might last a month, he said. Maybe 2. The number of people who come out from the east to claim land and find they can't manage it alone is considerable. It's not a weakness. It's just a hard thing to understand until you're in it. And now I think you'll be here in 10 years and the place will look better than Daniel ever got it to look. He said this without apology for the initial estimate because he was the kind of person who thought there was no point apologizing for a fair assessment honestly held. You're not what I expected. People rarely expect what I actually am, she said. It's a theme. What do you mean? She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, looking out at the south field where the corn was now knee-high and vivid green in the golden light. I've spent my whole life being told what I was capable of, what the appropriate limits were for a woman in my particular circumstances. And all of it was delivered as concern, you understand. It always is. Nobody says I don't think you can do this with malice. They say it with worry, which is somehow worse because then you can't even be angry about it without seeming ungrateful. And the territory, he said. People told you it would make you hard. She glanced at him. They did. Several people, my aunt, my former employer, the reverend at the corner church. She paused. As if the cost of surviving a hard place was necessarily the loss of everything soft and good in a person. You don't think that's true? I know it isn't. She said it with the certainty of someone who has had time to think a thing through completely. Hardness is something that happens when a person closes off to protect themselves. What the land does, what this work has done to me is something different. It's expansion. It's I am more than I was when I got here. Not tougher in the sense of having less, but larger. More of my own self than before. He was watching her with an attention that was doing something to the quality of the air between them, or perhaps she was imagining that. She was not sure. Clara Merriman said something like that, she added, because it seemed safer to bring in a third party, about becoming bigger rather than harder. Clara's a wise woman, Ezekiel said. But she was saying it about herself. You're saying something slightly different. Am I? You're saying you were already strong before you got here, he said, that the territory isn't what made you that way. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steadiness she had become accustomed to and still found each time to be faintly remarkable. Yes, she said, that's exactly what I'm saying. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to a casual observer, but she was not a casual observer. She had been watching his face with the careful attention of a person who has found a face worth watching, and in the small movement of something behind his eyes she read something she was not quite ready to name. He looked away first, which she also noted. "I should start unloading," he said. "You should," she agreed. But he did not move immediately, and neither did she, and the evening gathered itself softly around them with the patient quality of a country that has been old for a very long time and is in no particular hurry about anything. The trouble came in late summer, the way a lot of trouble came in 1878 in the New Mexico territory, slowly at first, and then all at once. It started with a man named Harlan Croft, who had been trying to buy up claims in the Pecos Valley for 2 years. He was not a rancher himself, but represented Eastern investors who had the particular kind of confidence that comes from having money in a place where money is relatively rare. And he operated on the theory that enough financial pressure, applied patiently enough to homesteaders struggling through their first seasons, would eventually produce the results he wanted. He was not a violent man, but he was not above using the threat of violence, or the general anxiety that threat created, as a tool. He came to Nora's claim on a Wednesday in late August, riding a good horse and accompanied by a younger man who wore a gun with the particular conspicuous arrangement of someone who wanted you to notice it. He was polite, in the manner of men who have been told their whole lives that manners cost nothing, and are therefore worth deploying freely as a tactic. He told her that he represented interests that were prepared to offer a very fair price for her claim. He told her that the valley was attractive land, and that investors with significant resources were prepared to develop it properly. He used the word properly with the particular emphasis of a man who believed that what had been done so far did not qualify. He looked at her cornfield, which was by that point tall and healthy and extremely obviously the product of serious work, and he either did not register what he was seeing or chose not to. "I'm not interested in selling," she said. He smiled the patient smile of a man prepared for this answer. "Miss Keller, I understand the attachment. But you're a young woman managing a substantial claim alone, and the territory is only going to become more challenging over the next few years. There are significant forces moving through this region. Cattle interests, railroad interests. It can be hard for a single operation to—" "I said I'm not interested," she said. "The claim is filed, the work is being done, and I intend to prove it out fully. If your investors have questions about the legality of my filing, they are welcome to address them at the land office in Santa Fe, which I have visited several times and where my paperwork is, I assure you, completely in order." The younger man shifted in his saddle, and Nora met his eye with the expression she had been developing since age 14, and he shifted back. Croft left without further incident, but something about the visit sat uneasily in her for the rest of the day. She talked to Roy Merriman the following morning, who confirmed that Croft had been to see all the Valley homesteaders at one point or another, and that Hector Vargas had received the most aggressive attention because his land was the most established, and therefore presumably the most attractive. When Ezekiel came through at the end of August, she told him about it, and she watched his face do the quiet, careful things it did when he was taking in information that mattered. "Croft's been operating in this region for a couple of years," he said. "He's backed by money from St. Louis. He hasn't done anything outright illegal yet, but there are 3 claims northwest of here that sold under what most people think was genuine pressure." "What kind of pressure?" "Fences cut, a well that went mysteriously brackish, the kind of things that are hard to prove as deliberate but are suspicious in pattern." He paused. "I don't say this to frighten you." "I know," she said. "You say it because it's information I need." "Yes." He turned his hat in his hands in a way she recognized as the physical expression of something he was working out internally. "I want you to know that if anything happens, if anything seems off, you should tell me." "Ezekiel," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not concerned. I'm concerned, but I don't need you to fix this for me." He looked at her with an expression that was complicated enough that she took a moment to read it. It was not wounded. It was not the particular male deflation she had seen on the faces of men who had been told they were not needed and took that as a criticism. It was something more specific than that, something that looked almost like careful recognition. "I know you don't," he said. "That's not what I meant. I meant that you're not alone out here. Not because you need someone to handle things for you, but because the valley is a community and people here help each other." Clara would want me to say the same thing, and Roy and the Vargases. You have people. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "For what?" "For understanding the difference." They looked at each other across the porch railing in the late summer heat, and the thing that had been building between them since the first ride out from Santa Fe was present in the space between them with an almost physical weight, like the pressure before a change in weather, and neither of them quite touched it yet. The crisis with Croft came to a head in September, when Nora discovered the fence on her east boundary had been cut in 3 places, and 2 of her horses were missing. She found the horses the following morning, having wandered a mile and a half toward the Merriman place, but the fence was cut too cleanly for accident, and she knew it. She rode to the trading post and sent a message to Santa Fe through the man who took mail, addressed to the land office registrar she had dealt with on her filing. She documented everything she could document: the cut wire, the placement, the timeline, the pattern of incidents Croft had created across the valley. Roy Merriman, who had a serious and useful anger about injustice that he channeled into paperwork when given the option, helped her organize the written record. Lucia Vargas, whose family had been working the law in this territory for a generation in ways that the land office records reflected clearly, talked her through the specific filings that would make the challenge to Croft's methods most effective. When Ezekiel arrived in mid-September, he found the fence repaired, the horses in the corral, and Nora at the kitchen table writing a letter in a hand that was steady and clear and very deliberate. "The fence was cut," she said without looking up. "I heard," he said. "Beaumont told me." He sat down across from her at the table. "What are you doing?" "Writing to the territorial governor's office," she said. "I've already written to the land office registrar, who was helpful and is making a file. The Vargases have documented their own incidents, the Merrimans as well. We have a pattern. A pattern is a case." He watched her write for a moment. "You put this together yourself," he said. "Lucia Vargas helped significantly. And Roy." She finished the sentence she was on and looked up. "We're not going to let him push us off land that's been legally filed and legally worked. He may have St. Louis money behind him, but we have a territorial legal framework that exists precisely to protect homesteaders, and I intend to use it." Ezekiel was quiet in the way that was his version of a great deal of feeling being very carefully held. "You're remarkable," he said. It was said simply, without the performance of a compliment. It was the same voice he used for all his true observations. She felt the word land on her like something warm and permanent. "I'm solving a problem," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp between them made the kitchen close and gold. "Ezekiel," she said, "what are we doing?" A pause. "At this moment you're writing a letter and I'm watching you write it. You know what I mean." He set his hat on the table. This was, she had noticed, what he did when he was about to say something that required his full attention, as if the hat was a physical representation of whatever protection a person puts between themselves and something they want badly. He set it down and he looked at her without it. "I've been coming through this valley 3 times a month for 7 years, he said. "In 7 years, not once have I sat at someone's kitchen table and watched them and thought, not once have I." He stopped. "You are the most interesting person I have encountered in this territory, and this territory is full of people who are interesting by necessity. And I think you know that what I feel when I come to this claim is not what a freighter feels about a regular stop on a route." She let out a slow breath. "No," she said. "I had gathered that." "I don't want to complicate your situation," he said. "You're building something here. You don't need Ezekiel." She said his name the way she said it when she wanted him to stop and hear her. He stopped. "I am not a person who needs to be protected from her own feelings. I am also not a person who will be diminished by caring about someone. If you're about to tell me that what you feel might be an inconvenience to what I'm building, I want you to understand that I find that slightly insulting." He blinked. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, something that started in his eyes and worked its way across his expression like the light changing across an open field. I didn't mean. I know you didn't mean it as an insult," she said. "You were trying to be considerate. I understand that. But I've been told my whole life what is and isn't good for me by people who thought they were being kind, and I have developed a fairly strong opinion about the value of making those decisions for myself." She looked at him steadily. "I feel things when you arrive here that I do not feel when you leave. That is information that belongs to me to act on as I see fit." He was very still. "What kind of things?" he said, and his voice was quieter than usual. "The particular kind that make a person think very carefully before they say something because they want to get it right," she said. The lamp guttered slightly in a breath of air from somewhere, and the kitchen was warm and close, and the letter on the table between them waited, and he reached across it and put his hand over hers, which was resting flat on the table beside the paper, and neither of them spoke for a moment because neither of them needed to. "I'll come back," he said. "Not just on the route, I'll come back." "I know," she said. "I've been counting on it for some time." The autumn was the most beautiful and the most complicated season she had known. The complaint she had sent to the territorial governor's office, combined with the documented pattern that the valley settlers had collectively assembled, created enough official attention that Croft's operations became considerably more visible and considerably more constrained. He did not disappear. He was not that kind of problem, not the kind with a clean resolution, but he pulled back from direct pressure, and the cut fences stopped, and the collective legal record that now existed in Santa Fe made any future move considerably riskier for him. It was not a complete victory, but it was the kind of practical, hard-won territorial justice that Lucia Vargas told her was as much as you could usually expect from the instruments available, and Nora found she could accept partial victories when they were genuinely secured. Ezekiel came back, as he had said, not just on the route. He came on Saturdays when there was no freight reason to be in the valley, riding out on his own horse with a quiet purposefulness that he did not try to disguise. He helped her with the things that were genuinely difficult for one person, setting the new roof beam on the small storage shed she was building, repairing the deep section of the corral where the post had rotted through. She cooked. They ate. They talked for long hours in the evenings, and the conversations were the kind that she had not had since before her mother died, the kind with enough substance and enough honesty to feel genuinely nourishing. He told her about his family, his parents who had come from County Cork in 1848 during the famine years, his father who had worked on the railroad until his back gave out, his mother who had kept them alive through the specific kind of fierce domestic competence that immigrant women brought to American poverty. He had 2 sisters, both in Colorado now, both married with children. He had left when he was 20 because the cattle work was available and the movement suited him, and he had been moving ever since. "Do you miss having a fixed place?" she asked one evening. The harvest was in, the corn and beans dried and stored, the root vegetables in the cold cellar under the house. The kitchen smelled of the herbs she had hung from the rafters to dry. He thought about it. "I've always told myself the movement was the point," he said, "that the freedom of not being anchored anywhere was worth more than whatever being anchored might provide." He paused. "I've been revising that assessment." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Have you?" "I find that a particular patch of ground in the Pecos Valley has become remarkably important to my sense of where I am at any given time," he said. "That's somewhat new." "And inconvenient, I should think," she said, "given the business." "Quite inconvenient," he agreed, and the warmth in his voice when he said it made inconvenience sound like the most welcome condition in the world. They kissed for the first time in October, on the porch in the cool, clear evening with the Milky Way laid out overhead in its full autumn abundance, and it was not a surprise to either of them by the time it happened, which was perhaps why it felt so entirely right. He had been sitting beside her on the bench she had built from timber salvaged from the old fence repair, and she had turned to say something about the constellation she was trying to identify, and he was looking at her rather than at the sky, and she stopped in the middle of her sentence and looked back at him, and the next thing that happened was very natural and very good and unhurried in the way that all his best qualities tended to be. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her face in the starlight with an expression that she read as a question, and then as an answer to its own question, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and she made hot tea, and they sat at the kitchen table and held hands like a couple who had been doing so for years, which in its way they had been practicing toward since a Tuesday morning in a Santa Fe livery stable when she had introduced herself, and he had listened with his full attention and looked at her like she was a person. In November he asked her to marry him. He did it at the kitchen table, which was their place, over the remains of supper, without ceremony, but also without any failure to understand the weight of what he was asking. He said that he had spent a significant portion of the past several months thinking about what he wanted the rest of his life to look like, and that the answer was becoming clear in ways that he thought she deserved to hear directly. He said that he was in love with her, stated plainly, without decoration, the way he said all his truest things. He said that he did not want to suggest by asking that she needed him, or that the claim needed him, or that any part of her singular and impressive independent enterprise required his contribution, but that he wanted to be part of her life in the most permanent and committed way available to him. And if that was something she wanted too, he would be the most grateful man in the territory. She looked at him for a long moment with the evaluative quality she brought to all important decisions, the specific attention of a woman who trusted her own judgment. "How do you feel about freighting?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "If you married me and based yourself here, you'd still be gone 3 weeks out of every month. Would that suit you? Would it suit a marriage?" He thought about it with the seriousness she loved. "I could reduce the route," he said. "Take fewer runs. Concentrate on the valley and the surrounding area. There's enough freight work in a 20-mile radius to make a reasonable income without being gone more than 2 or 3 days at a time. Could you give up the Santa Fe to Silver City run?" "Without significant grief," he said. "It's a long haul and the road in the southern section is punishing." "Then yes," she said. He stared at her. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. I love you." "I've been thinking about what to do about that since approximately May," which was when it became clear enough that ignoring it was no longer an option. She met his eyes. "I would like to note that I am saying yes because I want to, not because I need to, and that I expect to continue running this claim and making my own decisions and being generally as capable and independent as I have been, and that I would be grateful if you did not interpret marriage as a situation in which any of that changes." He was smiling, the full smile she had seen only a handful of times, the one that made him look significantly younger and almost undone with happiness. "Nora," he said, "I fell in love with you because you plow your own fields and write letters to the territorial governor, and look at men who are trying to intimidate you with an expression that makes them reconsider the fundamentals of their position. The last thing I want is to change any part of that." She was smiling now too, which she noticed with a small internal acknowledgement that she had not smiled this way in a very long time and had not been sure she remembered how. "Then we have a clear understanding," she said. "Very clear," he said. He reached across the table and she met him halfway. They married in December, in the small new church in the Valley settlement that the community had built together the previous spring. Clara and Roy Merriman stood with them. The Vargases came in their best clothes, and old Beaumont from the trading post wore a suit that was at least 30 years old but had been cared for with obvious attention, and there were perhaps 20 people in the room, which was everyone who mattered in the valley and then some. The reverend who performed the ceremony had ridden out from Santa Fe and seemed genuinely moved by the occasion, or perhaps by the extraordinary clarity of the December sky, which was the particular blue that clear winter days produce in high desert country. A blue so deep and specific it seemed like the sky was making an announcement. Nora wore her good dress, the dark green wool one she had packed in Cincinnati with no clear expectation of where she would wear it, and she pinned her hair up in the way she usually did not bother with on working days, and she walked to the front of the room beside Roy Merriman, who had been given this honor because Daniel was not there to give it. And she was not sad about Daniel in the particular way that grief works when it has been properly processed. Only quietly aware of his absence in the way that a room remains aware of a door, even when the door is closed. Ezekiel was standing at the front in his good shirt with his hat in his hands, and his face doing the thing that it only did when he was feeling something very large, that quality of deliberate steadiness over something deep and moving. And when she got to him, he looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the very first day, which was like she was a person worthy of his full and honest attention, and she thought that she would never tire of that look and suspected she was right. They said their words. The Reverend said his. Clara cried discreetly into a handkerchief, and Roy stood with the particular straight-back dignity of a man determined not to do the same. The Vargas children fidgeted, and their parents managed them with the patient, automatic skill of long practice, and old Beaumont said something in French under his breath that sounded approving. Ezekiel put a plain gold ring on her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe 3 weeks before he asked her, which she found, when she found out about it later, to be enormously characteristic of him. The preparation made in advance, quietly, without announcement, based on the confidence of a man who knew his own mind. The celebration afterward, at the Merriman place because it was the largest, went on through the afternoon and into the evening with food and music from a fiddle that Roy produced from somewhere and played with surprising competence. And there was dancing on the hard dirt floor and conversation that was the warm, easy kind that people have when they are genuinely glad about something. Nora danced with Ezekiel 3 times, which was the most she had danced in years, and she laughed more than once with her whole self. And when she looked at her husband's face in the firelight, she thought about a letter that had arrived on a Tuesday smelling of ink and false promises. And she thought that the word promises was perhaps more complicated than it first appeared, because the thing the letter had promised, buried under the grief and the difficulty and the long miles of hard country, was this: the chance to become more fully herself in a place that was large enough to hold her. She had been told that the territory would make her hard. She did not think anyone had been trying to be unkind when they said it. She thought they had been trying to protect her from something they understood as loss, the loss of the particular softness that seems, from a distance, like the best part of a person. What none of them had understood, what the territory itself had taught her, not through hardship alone but through the way hardship survived in community and with purpose becomes something else entirely, was that what they called hard and what she was were not the same thing. She was strong. She had been strong before she arrived. The territory had not made her, it had met her. There was a difference, and Ezekiel Rourke had understood it from the beginning, which was one of many reasons she loved him. Winter settled over the valley with the clean finality of a season that knows its own character, and Nora and Ezekiel made their life in the adobe house that Daniel had built, and she had repaired and improved and made genuinely hers. He reduced his freight route as he had said he would, taking only valley runs and the short haul to Beaumont's trading post, and he was home most nights, and the nights he was not were comfortable in their infrequency rather than difficult in their regularity. And she found that she had married a man who occupied a house without diminishing the woman who had made it a home, which was not as simple a thing to achieve as it sounded. He was useful in the physical work of the claim in ways she was grateful to acknowledge without feeling threatened by, because she had never been the kind of person who found help insulting, only the kind of help that came with the implication that she had needed rescuing. He did not approach the work that way. He worked beside her, not in front of her, And when he knew something she did not about a particular task, he shared the knowledge in the way that equals share things. And when she knew something he did not, which was often, he listened with the focused attention she had come to rely on. She taught him about the three-sister planting method that the Vargas family had shown her, the corn and beans and squash working together in the way that old knowledge works, each one supporting the others. He taught her about assessing road conditions and what to look for when buying a horse. They moved through knowledge together the way people move through a new country, each one pointing at things worth noticing. In the spring of 1879, she found she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting on the porch in the early warmth of an April that was finally beginning to mean something, and his face went through several things in rapid sequence before settling on something that was joy so large he appeared to need a moment to manage it. "Are you?" he started. "How are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I feel well. Clara says she had no troubles with either of hers, and there's no particular reason to expect difficulties." She paused. "I did want to note that I intend to continue working the claim for as long as is practical, and I'm going to need you to refrain from treating me like I've become fragile, because I have not." He was smiling so widely that his face could barely hold it. "Nora," he said, "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said, "and I know you're not fragile, and I know this is your decision to make and yours to manage, and I am here in whatever capacity you find useful and not in any capacity you don't." He reached over and took her hand and held it the way he had learned to hold it, not clasped tight like something precious he was afraid of losing, but resting, present, available. "I'm very happy," he said. "That's all, I'm very happy." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "So am I," she said. Clara, when told, produced the most practical and comprehensive catalog of pregnancy, knowledge, and advice Nora had encountered, delivered without sentimentality, but with the warmth of a woman who takes other women's well-being seriously. Lucia Vargas brought her specific remedies and teas, and told her things with the calm authority of a woman whose grandmother and great-grandmother had understood bodies and land, in ways that the medical establishment had barely begun to acknowledge. And Nora received this knowledge with the same respect she gave all knowledge that came from demonstrated competence rather than theoretical credential. The pregnancy was, as Clara had predicted, without notable difficulty. Nora worked the claim through June with minor adjustments to the heaviest work, which she distributed to Ezekiel without ceremony. And by July, she had arranged the logistics of harvest, so that the work could be managed with the help of the valley community in the way that harvest often was, each household helping the others through the season, the labor shared and returned in kind. The kind of practical mutual support that was not charity but community, and that she had come to understand as one of the genuine gifts of this life. Their son was born in November of 1879, which she found fitting, the same season in which she had arrived in the territory, now full circle to the arrival of someone new. He was born at dawn, which was both poetic and exhausting, with Clara at her side and Ezekiel in the next room working through the night hours with a combination of deliberate calm and barely suppressed terror that she could hear in his footsteps through the adobe wall, and found, in the strange elevated clarity of that long night, to be deeply and specifically endearing. Clara put the baby in her arms just as the first light was coming through the east window, and he was red and loud and completely real in the way that only very new things are completely real, and she held him and looked at his face, which was inscrutable in the way that all new faces are inscrutable, full of a person not yet revealed. She asked Clara to get Ezekiel. He came through the door with the expression of a man who has been afraid for many hours and is only now being permitted to stop, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the baby in her arms with the deliberate, careful attention he brought to everything important, and then he looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said, and he meant it in every possible way a person could mean it. "Yes," she said. "Very." She tilted the baby toward him. "Would you like to hold your son?" He took the baby with the particular awkward care of a man holding a baby for the first time, and being very aware that this is the most important thing he has ever held, and adjusting his arms accordingly. And the baby regarded the new arrangement with the philosophical equanimity of very small people. And Ezekiel said nothing for a long time, just looked at the face in his arms. "He looks like you," he said finally. "He looks like a very small person who has had a difficult morning," she said. "Give him a few days." Ezekiel laughed, which was the specific laugh of a man who is too full of feeling to express it any other way, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled, and the morning light came fully into the room, and Clara, who had gone to make coffee with the tact that was one of her finest qualities, called from the kitchen that it was ready, and outside the valley was cold and clear and entirely itself. They named him Daniel James Rourke. Daniel for the brother who had given them both, in his way, this life. James for Ezekiel's father, who had crossed an ocean to make room for his children's futures. It seemed right to carry both forward. The years that followed were the kind of years that are not dramatic in the way that the first year of building a life is dramatic, but are rich in the slower, more layered way of things that have been established and are now deepening. Nora proved out the homestead claim in full, satisfying every requirement of the Homestead Act with the meticulous attention she brought to all legal and practical matters, and the deed was transferred to her name. And then, after their marriage, to their names together, with the official weight of territorial records. Croft's operation eventually collapsed under the accumulation of documented complaints and the particular pressure of a territorial administration that was, by 1880, attempting to demonstrate more systematic governance. He did not go to prison. The legal mechanisms of 1880 New Mexico were not yet sophisticated enough to make that the likely outcome. But he left the region, and the claims he had pressured remained with their original filers, and the valley settled into its own character without his shadow over it. Nora expanded the claim's cultivated acreage over the next 3 years, working with Hector Vargas on an irrigation arrangement that improved both their operations considerably. She also, in the way that people who are genuinely good at a thing find their usefulness spreading beyond their original context, became an informal point of advice for newly arriving homestead claimants, particularly women, several of whom arrived in the valley in the early 1880s as the government's land programs brought more settlers west. She did not advertise this role. It simply accumulated around her, the way competence tends to accumulate into purpose. Ezekiel reduced his freight work further as the years went on, as their operation became self-sufficient enough that the additional income was less essential. He kept 1 or 2 regular runs by choice. He had been right that the movement was part of his nature, but they were short runs, valley routes, and he was home most nights, which suited both of them in the way that things suit people who have thought clearly about what they actually want rather than what convention suggests they should want. In 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Maries, which had been Ezekiel's mother's middle name, and which had a sound that Nora found she liked the way she liked certain words, not for their meaning alone, but for the shape they made in the mouth. Maries arrived in summer rather than winter, which was easier in several practical respects, and she arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, apparently having decided to make the transition from theoretical to actual with comparative efficiency. She was dark-haired like her father and had her mother's eyes, and what Clara, who was present again as she had been for Daniel's birth, and would not have been anywhere else, described as a look of general determination that did not surprise anyone who knew the family. Daniel was 3 by then, and took the existence of his sister with the philosophical equanimity of a 3-year-old who had been well loved enough to feel secure, examining her with the careful attention that was already, at 3, identifiably his father's quality. He touched her head with one careful finger and looked at his parents, and said she was very small, which she was, and which they confirmed was accurate, and he seemed to find this a satisfactory conclusion to the investigation. On the evening after Maurice was born, when the house was quiet and Clara had gone home, and Daniel was asleep in the small bedroom that had been given over to him 2 years earlier, and the baby was sleeping in the cradle Ezekiel had built that winter from good pine timber, Nora sat on the porch in the summer dark with her husband beside her, the way they had sat on so many evenings in the years since she had first arrived here. And the valley was full of its night sounds, and the stars were making their usual extraordinary statement overhead. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the letter," she said. "The one that brought me here." He was quiet beside her, listening in the way he listened. "I thought about it for a long time as something that was about loss," she said. "Daniel dying, the claim existing, the whole question of whether I was capable of making anything of it. And then it was about survival, whether I could do the work, whether I could hold the claim against men like Croft, whether the territory would." She paused. "Whether it would be harder than I was." "And," he said. "And it wasn't about any of those things," she said. "Or it was about all of them, but that's not what it turned out to be. It turned out to be about this." She gestured slightly at the house behind them, at the darkness of the field where things were growing, at the sound of the baby breathing through the open window. "It turned out to be about all of it together, about what you build when you commit to a place and to people and to work that has meaning." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. "Your aunt told you the territory would make you hard," he said. He had heard this story from her over time in pieces. "She did," Nora said. "She was wrong," he said. "She was," Nora agreed, "not out of malice, just out of not knowing the difference between hard and strong. There's a significant difference." "There is," she said. "Hard is what happens when you close off to protect yourself. Strong is what happens when you stay open in spite of everything that says you should close. Hard is the absence of feeling. Strong is the presence of feeling with the courage to keep moving anyway." He found her hand in the dark. "You were strong before any of this," he said. "Before you got on the train, before you filed the claim, you were already this." "I know," she said quietly. "That's what I've been trying to tell people since before I could articulate it properly." "And now," he said, "now I can articulate it properly," she said. He squeezed her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The night settled around them with the generous ease of a summer that has been fully arrived into, fully inhabited, and they sat in the darkness that was not frightening because it was theirs, that was not lonely because it was shared, that was not diminishing because they had both, separately and then together, become exactly the size they needed to be. Inside, the baby made a small sound and then was quiet again. In the children's room, Daniel slept with his characteristic wholeness, the deep, untroubled sleep of a child who is entirely certain of his place in the world. The stars overhead were the same stars that had been overhead on every night she had stood on this porch, from the first night alone in her brother's house to this night with her husband beside her and 2 children inside, and they were neither more nor less than they had been, as magnificent and as indifferent as they had always been. But she had a better relationship with magnificence now, a more comfortable one. You did not need to be reduced by what was larger than you. You could simply look at it and be glad it existed and go inside and tend to the things that were yours to tend to. She was 30 years old and she had built something real. Spring came again in 1883, the 5th spring since she had stood on this porch for the first time, with the smell of her brother's old life around her, and the mountains to the east and the south field waiting, and the valley was in full flowering with the particular energy of late April, when everything is pushing upward at once, and the air has that specific quality of potential that only the beginning of the growing season produces. Nora was planting with Ezekiel on a clear Thursday morning, working side by side down the rows of the expanded south field, with the comfortable coordination of people who have done the same work together for enough seasons that they have found their own natural rhythm in it. Daniel was old enough now to be genuinely useful in small ways, and was engaged in the work with the serious application of a child who has been included in real things and knows it. Maurice, at 11 months, was in the sling Lucia Vargas had shown Nora how to make, against her mother's chest, alternating between sleeping and regarding the field with the considered expression she brought to most things. Clara came over the ridge in the early afternoon with her oldest child running ahead of her and a covered dish in her hands, which was her way of announcing a visit, and they stopped work and sat in the shade of the porch and ate together, and the children played in the yard, and the April light moved across the field in the way April light moves, with particular attentiveness, as if the season itself is paying close attention to its own progress. "You look well," Clara said to Nora with the directness that was her constant quality. "I feel well," Nora said, "very well." "Good," Clara said, and it was the simple, satisfied good of a woman who had watched another woman build a life and was genuinely glad about the outcome. Ezekiel was talking to Roy, who had come over an hour later with the half-apologetic purposefulness of a man who had timed his arrival to coincide with whatever Clara had brought. The two men sat on the steps and talked about the state of the road to Beaumont's place and the new family that had arrived at the north end of the valley the previous week, and what the summer was likely to look like based on what the spring had shown so far. Nora watched Ezekiel from across the yard, watched him gesture with his hands in the way he did when he was making a point he considered important, watched the afternoon light on his face and the ease with which he existed in this place he had committed to, and she thought that she had understood something when she arrived here that she had not quite had the words for then, but had now. She had been told the territory would make her hard. The people who said it had been wrong, but they had been wrong from a place of caring, which she had long since forgiven because the distinction between caring and understanding was one she felt a good deal of compassion for. It was hard to understand from the outside how a difficult place could produce not hardness but expansion, how loss could open into abundance, how a woman who arrived alone with $43 and a trunk could be sitting 5 years later on a porch she owned, on land she had proven and secured, with a husband who loved her in the specific and useful way that she needed to be loved, and 2 children who were going to grow up understanding that a person's value was not determined by their vulnerability, and a community around her that was knit together by the kind of mutual dependence that creates genuine loyalty, rather than the kind that exists only in good weather. Ezekiel looked across the yard and caught her watching him and smiled, which was his full smile, the one that still made him look years younger and still produced in her the same warm, accurate, completely unnecessary surprise that it always had. She smiled back. Daniel ran past on some urgent 3-year-old business, and Mari's made an interested sound against her chest, and the valley was loud with birds and the particular clean sound of a wind coming off the mountains to the west, and the field they had planted that morning was ready and waiting for everything it was going to become, and Nora Rourke, who had been Nora Keller, who had come to this place with nothing but her own considerable self and a legal document and the absolute refusal to be less than what she was, sat in the April sun and felt the full and specific weight of a life that was genuinely, completely, and with full knowledge of its own difficulty, good. She had not been made by this country. She had met it. That was something entirely different, and it had made all the difference there was. The years continued in the way that good years continue, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the condition of all real things, but with the particular resilience of a life built on honest foundations and maintained with honest hands. The claim was officially and irrevocably hers, the deed in her name and his together, a legal document in the Santa Fe records that represented every fence post and every planted row and every difficult morning and every long evening and every conversation on the porch under the vast and honest sky. The children grew, Daniel into a quiet, observant boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's stubbornness in approximately equal measure, and who could already, at 4, Name every plant growing in the south field and explain why each one was where it was. Mari's into a person of considerable and early expressed opinions, which neither parent found surprising and both found delightful. On the 5th anniversary of Nora's arrival in the valley, Ezekiel came in from the evening feeding of the horses to find her standing at the kitchen table looking at the original deed, the one the land office clerk in Santa Fe had given her on that first day when everything was still uncertain and very new. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked up. "How little I knew that morning," she said, "about what this would become." He came and stood beside her, looking at the document with her. "Is that strange?" he said. "To not have known?" "No," she said. "I think it's probably necessary. If you fully understood at the beginning what the middle was going to cost, you might not start. And then you'd miss the end." She turned and looked at him. "And the end is very good." He put his arm around her. "The end," he said. "We're a long way from the end." "The middle, then," she corrected. "The current stage which contains everything I came here for and everything I didn't know to come here for." She leaned into him. "Both." Outside, the New Mexico territory lay in the particular stillness of its own enormous night, and the adobe house held its warmth against the cool air, and the children were sleeping, and the stars were their habitual extravagant selves, and Nora Rourke, formerly Keller, strong from before she arrived and built larger by everything since, stood in the kitchen of the house she owned on the land she had made real and breathed in the life she had chosen, and knew it to be, in every possible sense of the word, enough. More than enough, everything.